Chapter 8. The man had changed since that long-ago night in Baltimore. Thin before, he was gaunt now, nothing but skin and bones. The wrinkles Crawford had taken for signs of age were, he saw now, signs of exhaustion. Fellows's eyes were sunk deep into his sockets. The man looked as if he'd been to hell and back. "You've been chasing me so long, detective, and yet you don't recognize me?" Crawford couldn't say a word, couldn't move his mouth. "Speak to me, detective." Fellows leaned over Crawford, grabbed his hair, pulled his head back so his throat was exposed. Crawford heard a noise behind him, wind, rustling at the shades of a window. Fellows turned. "He comes." Crawford tried to turn his head, and failed. His field of vision was limited to Fellows on his right, and Green, sitting at the coffee table directly opposite him. "It shall be as you say, Okie." Fellows nodded. He lifted his shirt. A hunting knife in a scabbard hung from his belt. He drew it and advanced toward Crawford. The detective strained with all his might, willing his legs to kick out, his head to turn away, his body to do something, anything. "You cannot move, but neither can you feel. There will be no pain." Fellows smiled. "Yet." Crawford stared straight ahead. His eyes met Green's. Fellows bent over him, blocking out the deputy. The knife glinted. Crawford felt a gentle tugging at his forehead. Something dripped past his eye. Fellows straightened up. He wiped the knife on his jeans and put it back in the scabbard. "Now we—" There was a loud crash. Fellows turned quickly, surprise etched on his features. Green had somehow managed to move his arm. He'd pulled his gun out of his holster and dropped it on the floor. Fellows smiled. "Deputy Green, let me get that for you." Fellows bent down and picked it up. Green's eyes showed a mixture of terror and defiance. "I would have let you live, but when the killing is so easy—" Fellows shot Green square in the forehead. The deputy toppled forward onto the coffee table. Blood pooled around his head. Bile rose in Crawford's throat. He fought it down. He had to stay calm. Fellows turned back to Crawford. "Now we can go." He bent down and slung Crawford over his shoulder. Crawford felt his eyes getting heavy. He fought it. He didn't know what Fellows had planned. He didn't know if he'd ever wake up. Fellows walked deeper into the house, through a swinging door. Crawford's head bounced limply against the man's back. Where his forehead touched Fellows' shirt, it left dark stains. Still, he felt nothing. They walked from one room into another, and then another. Crawford's vision swam. He looked up and saw a body, dangling from a ceiling joist. The one body became two, then three, then— His eyes closed. When he opened them, he was outside, lying spread eagle on the ground. No, not ground, a rock. The full moon shone down on him, through a break in the clouds. He heard running water. He blinked. Whatever Fellows had put in his drink had worn off. He tried to stand. His arms and legs were fastened securely to the rock. The wind blew, carrying with it the scent of the forest, of freshly turned earth, of something suddenly very familiar to Crawford. He thought a moment and placed it. The smell of the grave, rising up as he dug. And behind that smell, another, much worse. The foul odor of the decaying and the dead. The odor came from his right. Crawford turned his head to look. He saw Fellows a dozen feet away, kneeling on the rock. In one hand he held a branch the size of a baseball bat. In the other, a rope. He was tying something to the end of the branch. A human hand. Crawford strained at his bonds. He lifted his head up and held it off the rock. He saw more branches, each the same size as the one Fellows held, perhaps larger. Each had something tied to the end of it. All had been neatly laid out on the rock. Laid out in the shape of a man. 2 feet, 2 hands, 2 legs, 2 arms. A head. "Jesus," he whispered. It was a life-size version of the stick figure Callahan had found in the cemetery. Fellows was really doing it, the crazy bastard. He was building his god a new body. Crawford fell back against the rock. Fellows turned and looked at him. In the light from the full moon, his eyes shone. "Soon," was all he said. Crawford pulled at the ropes tying him down, strained to see how they were attached to the rock, if he could rub on them anywhere, fray the edges, something, anything to get himself loose and away from this madman and whatever he was planning to do. Fellows began chanting, "Here is the body you must live in, Okie, made from the dead and the unborn, from the fool and the wise person, from your people and from strangers. Here is your new body, Okie." Crawford stopped straining and closed his eyes. This was absolutely insane. He wanted the last 8 hours to live over again. He wanted the chance to tell Sharon he was sorry for running out in the middle of vacation. He wanted the chance not to run out in the middle of vacation. He wanted to snap the cuffs on Fellows. He wanted... Do you know where we are? Crawford looked up. Fellows stood over him, stripped to the waist. His entire body was covered with scars, the same kind of scars that had been on Jessica Elder's forehead, on the other women. He had a pouch of some kind around his neck. It looked like as if it had been made from an animal's paw. "This is Oki's house," Fellows said. "It is a sacred place, a magical place. The first time Mountain Bear brought me here, Oki's spirit spoke to me." Crawford struggled. He cried out frustration. "I heard his commands, and I obeyed," Fellows said. "I gathered the things he needed." Again, Crawford wanted to laugh. He flashed on an image of Fellows making out a shopping list. Eye of newt, wing of bat, hand of... He made himself stop. "Oki has a long journey to make to his new body. You will help me guide him." "Sure, be happy to," Crawford said. "Take these ropes off." "That won't be necessary." Fellows reached into the pouch around his neck and pulled out something. Crawford squinted to make out what it was. Fellows squatted next to him. He had something cupped in one hand. "Open your mouth, detective." Crawford clamped his teeth together. He'd be goddamned if he'd let this bastard put any more drugs into him. Fellows bent over and pinched Crawford's nose shut with the thumb and index finger of one hand. Then he waited. Crawford held his breath as long as he could. He began to see stars. Finally, he had to open his mouth. The second he did, Fellows jammed one hand in, held the jaw open. With the other, he put something in Crawford's mouth. Crawford tasted something foul. He held it in his throat. Fellows took his hand out. Crawford quickly turned his head and spat to one side, away from Fellows. "Gah!" A handful of dried mushrooms lay on the rock next to him. He'd eaten at least one of them. He glared up at Fellows. The man was feeding him mushrooms. Were they poison? Psychedelics? Canned? "You bastard!" He'd never felt more helpless in his life. "When I get loose, your spirit is loose now, detective. Show Oki the way." Crawford opened his mouth to say something else. Then the world exploded. He stood in a foot of snow. Two Indians, a woman and a man, leaned over the body of a small boy. Both were crying. Another, a young man with an elaborate seashell necklace, stood a few paces back. They did not see him. He was there, but not there. "My son would not listen, Eaglefeather," the woman said. The language she spoke was not English, but Crawford understood it anyway. "He would not wear the necklace." "What is done, said the old man. "Now we must protect his spirit from Oki." Something roared in the trees just beyond them. Crawford's heart raced. "The evil one is nearby," said the old man. "We must hurry." Eaglefeather took a handful of red berries and crushed them over the boy's body. It was the middle of the day. He was standing on the bank of a stream, in the middle of a dense forest. He stood next to 5 other men. They all carried antique hunting rifles on their shoulders. They all wore 19th century hunting clothes. "Tom, look!" One man pointed downstream. They all turned in unison. There was the rock Crawford had been lying on seconds ago. A little girl was standing on it holding a doll. She waved to them. "It's her," one man said. "The Weaver girl." The men lowered their rifles and walked forward. The girl saw him and smiled. He was standing on the rock again, looking down at a little boy and a man camped next to the stream. The man was putting up a tent, with his back to Crawford. The boy was staring up at the rock, his eyes wide with fear. Crawford recognized him. From where? The headline flashed in his mind. 9-year-old son treated for shock. He was somewhere indoors. A dark, damp room. A basement. He was facing the corner. Behind him, he heard a child sobbing. "Hush now," a man's voice. "Soon you won't feel a thing." Lightning flashed. He was lying on the rock again. A few feet away, Fellows knelt, watching. "Your journey was short." Crawford blinked. What the hell had just happened? His face was wet. It had begun to rain. Clouds swirled above. The moon peeked through once, twice, and then was gone. It was pitch dark. Where had he gone? How long had he been? Time is different here. It was as if Fellows were reading his mind. "I stayed on this rock through an afternoon and a night, the first time Mountain Bear brought me here. When we returned to Elder's house, only an hour had passed." Lightning flashed again. The wind howled. Fellows stood. The knife was back in his hand. "Oki is coming." It began raining harder. The rain plastered the t-shirt to Crawford's body. Fellows stood over him. Are you ready? If you're going to kill me, go ahead and get it over with. Fellows shook his head. The knife is not for you, detective. Holding the knife in his right hand, Fellows drew the blade gently across the palm of his left. He held that hand up in the air. Drops of blood poured down on the rock. He began walking in a circle around Crawford. Here is the end of your journey, Oki. There is blood to quench your thirst, and meat to fill your belly. Here is your new body, Oki. Rise up and feast. The circle enclosed the stick figure he'd built as well. When he finished, he sat down outside that circle and crossed his legs. The rain was falling harder. The wind blew in gusts. Crawford watched as the mist that had covered the road on their journey to the reservation rose up from the ground. It blanketed the rock around him. It swallowed Fellows. And still it came, getting thicker and thicker until finally he could barely see a foot in front of him. The sounds of the forest around him vanished. The chirping of the crickets, the buzzing of insects, the falling rain. Everything was quiet. It was as if the mist were a blanket, muffling all noise. A minute passed. Crawford heard something scrape across the rock. He twisted against the ropes again. They didn't budge. Nearby, something groaned. There was a kind of rustling noise, and another groan, even closer. That smell again, of moist black earth, of the grave. He sensed something looming above him. Sensed, rather than saw. The mist was so thick, he couldn't see more than a foot in front of him. It was a person. It was Fellows, of course. But the way he was walking, more like he was shambling, really, not at all the way he had moved just a minute before, his arms stiff, his hands dangling low as if, no. It was Fellows, he told himself. It had to be Fellows. A hand, cold and clammy, reached out and touched him then. For the first time since he had been a little boy, Randy Crawford screamed.